I would like to introduce our speaker of today. Simon has worked for NIAB for nearly 38 years, concentrating mainly on variety testing and on a range of crop species. Since 1990, he has been the specialist for oilseed and pulse and crops, conducting varieties trials and advising farmers on variety choice through published booklets and articles and at field demonstration. He has also designed and managed numerous agronomy experiments within his crop sector and recently participated in 2 large interdisciplinary projects looking at the nutritional value of rapeseed meal and tried beans on non-ruminant rations. Simon is a board member of the Global Organization for Oilseed Rape and Masters, which organizes the International Rapeseed Congress every 4 years. Now, I give the microphone to Simon for the presentation.
Okay, can you hear me, Silvia? And can you see me?
I can hear you, but
start my webcam.
You cannot
start sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see you.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, and pleased to meet you all. And straight into where's my presentation?
It's coming.
Ah, good. That would be useful. Okay, so the title, as you can see, is New Approaches to Managing Cabbage Stem Flea Beetles in Oilseed Rape. And of course, this...
Simon, just maybe you should move a bit the microphone because it is probably too close.
Okay.
Can you try now?
Let's try that.
That's perfect.
Okay, looks a bit funny, but never mind. So the obvious subtext here is life after neonicotenoid seed treatments and how we're going to survive and grow the crop. And how do I go to the next slide? I don't think we covered that. Okay, here is the pest that I'm going to be talking about, Ciliodes chrysocephala. Oh, Sylvia, where is the next slide button? I can't. I just.
Yes. Yes. At the bottom there are 2 arrows. One is going up, one is going down.
Yeah. Okay. So. Here's the cabbage stem flea beetle, or as I prefer to call it, public enemy number 1. This is the beetle that has dominated and ruined my life for the last 3 years, and I want to share some of that despair with you today. So I think I need to do quite a lot of background before I get to the main topic, which will be discussing companion crops in oilseed rape. But the background starts, well, for us in the UK, we started growing oilseed rape in 1970, and by 1984 we had a good understanding of the pests, and the Agricultural Development and Advisory Service in 1984 described the damaging pests in the central counties of Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Cambridgeshire, across into East Anglia, Essex, also up into Northamptonshire and Oxfordshire and parts of Warwickshire. Now, in those early days, we could control cabbage stem flea beetles with a chemical gamma-HCH, or gamma-col. But that was banned in 1999, and for 1 season we had no effective seed treatments. I'll come back to that. Subsequently, we saw the first of the neonicotenoid seed treatments, which was Chinook. Interestingly, during that 1 year when we had no seed treatment, there was almost no damage from the cabbage stem flea beetle. It was quite remarkable. People would talk to you and say, "Oh, I saw a shot hole in a leaf today." And that is as far as it went. The damage was almost non-existent. So we've had 3 years since the neonic ban, harvest years 15, 16 and coming up to 17, and there have been three very contrasting experiences. And, as I put here, most of them have been very unpleasant and very depressing. In the 14-15 season, the Munich ban coincided with very high numbers of cabbage stem flea beetles in the agricultural environment, and I would put this down to the increasingly warm winters that we've had in recent times. And there's a very critical temperature of 3 degrees below which egg laying and larval development ceases. So in warm winters, the development of the population of cabbage stem flea beetles continues very actively. Now, in that autumn 14, the conditions for establishment in this part of the country were very poor. It was cool and dry in early September, and the crops developed very, very slowly. As a result of that, and the numbers of the flea beetles, the damage on some of the crops and my trials was very extensive indeed. It was so bad that after about the 27th of August, in the Cambridge area, there were no successful established trials. And I suppose I'm in a slightly unique position talking about trials, because trials inevitably go into the ground during the second half of the planting season. The farmers will start in about the 15th of August, but normally because of the large numbers of trials that need to be organised, we don't really do most of our trials sowing until the beginning of September. And we were astonished by the severity of the damage we saw. Normally I would expect some damage to the cotyledons, but what we were seeing was that the beetles were destroying the plants before they ever emerged, at the cotyledon stage and at quite advanced stages, with perhaps 3 or 4 leaves. This is just a detailed picture of what happened locally. We were not expecting anything as bad as it happened, so we didn't have an extensive farm survey in place. But you can see there are a lot of organisations in the Cambridge area who are growing variety trials. And we all had the same sort of experience. I'll just go round the clock. So our friends at Sarton Union, with their early drilling, they had a successful trial at this site here, Wickenbrook, but going to the following week, their trial failed. And so it is in nearly every case. Our main trial was shared a field with a farm crop which was sown early and was successful. Our own trials failed miserably. We lost 4,080 plots. It was a terrible, terrible disaster for us. And it was the same with colleagues around the region. KWS, they drilled 29th of August, failed, tried re-drilling mid-September, and that failed, and so on, round the clock. You can check on all these details in the recorded version afterwards, but I won't take up too much time. But there's just one word to describe this. It is disaster. For me, it was undermining everything I've spent my life working for. Perhaps I'm exaggerating a little bit. Of course, it's not the worst thing in the world. That was clearly Brexit, but don't get me started on that subject. But when we thought about it, and when we saw the clear symptoms of cabbage stem flea beetle damage, we realised that we'd been seeing it previously over the last perhaps 3 or 4 years. Here's an example of a trial near Cambridge where one edge of the field emerged successfully and just disappeared again, and we realised now it was cabbage stem flea beetles. But we were in denial because the seed was treated with neonic seed treatments, and we just couldn't believe that the beetles could do this much damage, but they did. The extraordinary thing is that for many years the breeders have been running their own trials without any seed treatments at all and surviving quite well. So the signs had been there, and we now realised that the situation was down to the vast numbers of beetles that were building up in the population. I'll just summarise the next 2 years before we get back into the detail. In 2015-16, conditions were much better. We had better rainfall, it was warmer, but there were still very high numbers of adult beetles, and we continued to lose trials and commercial crops. The winter was very warm compared with normal, and so there was a very prolonged egg-laying and larval development period, and the larvae infested many crops and caused branching from the ground and stunting of the crops. And some of these backward crops were later attacked by other pests such as pigeons and pollen beetles. And it was a low-yielding year. 16-17 was a different year again. It was another dry September with high adult beetle numbers. Again, many commercial crops suffering. But since then, the last winter, the autumn in particular, was quite cold, and so the egg-laying period was shortened. Already the reports are of fewer larvae in the petioles of the surviving plants, and crops are developing well during the normal flowering period of April. So we're hoping and praying that we might be seeing reduced beetle pressure going into autumn 2017. So let's take you through what we know about the pest and ask the questions whether it's out of control. And just mentioning that it is resistant, large proportions of the population are resistant to pyrethroid insecticides, so it's very difficult to control without seed treatments. My friend Dr. Samantha Cook at Rothamsted presented this slide at the last GCIRC Congress in Saskatoon, and it summarises the life cycle beautifully. Let's go, and what I want you to pick up from this is the very long periods that each of the phases occupies, which makes it very difficult to control the pest at any one point in time. But in August to October, the adult beetles move into the crops and start grazing. They hide in the soil so they can eat the emerging shoots under the ground sometimes. And then in a long period, August to February, they go into their egg-laying phase, and the eggs hatch and move into the petioles of the plants during August to March. And over another long period of time, these larvae complete their development and drop out of the plants and pupate in the ground. And in May to July, the adult beetles are emerging. They go through a brief period of feeding, and then this strange term, estivate. They rest in sheltered areas until it's time to go back onto the attack in the crop. And another great expression that I learned is univoltine, so it's just one cycle per year. So thank you for that, Sam Cook. Larval feeding damage has only really come to our attention during spring of 2016, when it was seen at really intense levels with, perhaps 80 plus plants, larvae per plant, and that's a huge number. And these levels were widely reported, but having got through that winter, a lot of these stunted crops did actually recover quite nicely. Here we are. This is the beetles in the petiole, just a single petiole. I think I've counted 10 larvae in this one petiole. And this is what can happen. They can kill off the growing point so that the plant branches. Then you get into delayed flowering and extended vulnerability to winter pests. The problem with the larvae is that they are virtually immune to any sprays that we've got to attack them with whilst they're in the plant. They do migrate from leaf to leaf during the season, but this is never mass migration, so there's never a good time to kill a large number of beetles. It's very difficult to assess the yield loss associated with this, but it's obvious that if you've got low populations in your crop, then the damage is going to be more intense because the beetles concentrate on the number of plants. Okay, what we don't know. We don't know much about the dispersal distance or timing of the adults. We don't know whether all we really need is 2 or 3 very cold winters to knock the population back, or alternatively whether a planned moratorium, organising people to stop growing rape in a particular region, would overcome the problem. One of the main forms of dispersal is in the grain trailer, and it's normal to look inside a trailer or on a heap of grain in the shed and see it seething with beetles on the surface, and then marching like an army away from the heap off to the door of the grain shed and out into the farm, and presumably then flying off to find a new crop. So here they are. I'm just picking the pointer tool. You can see little beetles in there, but when you look at the heap of grain, it's just mass. The whole surface of the heap of the grain will be moving. Now, my good friend Albin Gunnarsson from Sweden sent me this data, and it shows that Swedish observations are that there appears to be an 8 or 9 year population cycle associated with cabbage stem flea beetles, and I think we've both been hoping that perhaps we're already suffering from a cyclical spike in beetle numbers. We've got one more. He sent me an update on this slide, the 2015 findings, which associated with the same neonic ban across Europe. So it's happening in Sweden as well, and their numbers are shooting up. When you look at the actual numbers on the scale here, they are very tiny compared with ours, but it's the principle of the cycle. How useful this will be in interpreting the UK situation is difficult to know, because obviously the colder continental climate we would expect to have a much more suppressing effect on beetle populations than our mild oceanic climate in the United Kingdom. So let's go back and think about 2015-16 in some detail. And we put a lot of effort into working out how to get our trials to survive. And these are some of the measures we took. using an experimental license to use some neonic treated seed, for some of our more precious trials, we sowed an early sown seed treated crop around the area that was planned for the trial, in the hopes that this would attract beetles in and kill them. And we, at the time of drilling the trials, we filled up the pathways and put in strips through the trials, making a checkerboard effect of treated seed, which would be destroyed before flowering time and harvest. We put a lot of effort into improved seedbed preparation, because we do believe that it's absolutely essential to get good, rapid emergence once you've sown, and that will come through very close contact between soil and seed and the soil moisture. We started using starter fertilizers in the drill, and we used a neonicotenoid seed insecticide spray. Particular one we used was Insist, because we'd already observed that pyrethroids were virtually useless, but we had to attack the proportion of the population that was sensitive to them and put on multiple sprays, which of course is no good at all for the background beneficial insects. We used irrigation where it was available, and for some of our specialized work we started experimenting with insect netting, fine aphid mesh, which is clearly not economic to put over large areas, but for small demonstration areas we tried it, and I'll show you the results in a minute. Oh, there was also help from the government in that season, acknowledging the threat to commercial crops. They passed a derogation, a special permission for neonic seed to be used in the worst affected counties on a fairly limited scale, and they also gave a derogation for the use of these neonicotenoid insecticide sprays, which I've mentioned already. So that was some good news. So these are my demonstration plots drilled in autumn 2015 on the same field where I had had complete failure the previous year, and we used this insect netting to protect those, and it worked perfectly. It just shows that there were no beetles hiding in the soil. It stopped them flying in from outside. In that season, as I've said in the introduction, the rainfall and the temperatures were much more favourable, and we had quite reasonable luck in our earliest sowings right at the end of August, but our luck ran out with the slightly later sowings. There continued to be widespread reports of farm crop failures, and something we'd picked up in the previous year, the neonicotenoid seed treatments, where they were allowed, were not necessarily giving good control. We also saw some very interesting effects from pre-emergent herbicides, which I'll come to in a second. We think they were holding the crops back, and there was a huge problem with larvae again. So, yeah, pre-emergent herbicides. Just by coincidence, I was running a separate series of trials of the new Clearfield varieties. They're resistant to the herbicide Clearander, and we were growing them under a Clearander herbicide regime without pre-emergent herbicides. What I saw very, very clearly was that these this trial got away much more strongly than the rest of the field, which had been treated with pre-emergent herbicides. And these are the products we use. I'm not pointing the finger at any one chemical in particular. We use Banistar and Cirrus, and undoubtedly, in the greater scheme of things, they are very effective herbicides. But quite clearly, they do slow down early growth and make crops more vulnerable to beetle damage. In that year, we also developed a crowdsourcing survey to find out what was happening on farms with our members. We have a membership of farmers across the whole country. We wanted to find out what was happening with the problem. How extensive was it? Is it spreading? Is it to do with sowing date? How weather dependent is it? Is it affected by the establishment method and the cultivations that the farmers have used? And we wanted to see whether neonic seed treatments really work or not. So here's a nice map. I love this survey. The farmer goes onto it, he gets onto the site, clicks a button, and he can drop a pin on his farm or his field or a number of fields, and is immediately asked a series of questions, and we get that data back, but immediately he sees the state of his crop that as assessed by the answers he's given, to see whether it's not affected or very severely affected, going from green to red, and the size of the pin is an indication of the crop area that is being reported. So that gave us our opening shot of what was happening nationally. My regret is that in that season I didn't ask people to put an entry in to say if they had already stopped growing oilseed rape because of the problem. We'll come back to that when we look at the survey for the following year. So this is some of the data, and these are the responses of damage set against sowing time, and you'll see from really the middle of August to the middle of September encapsulates the sowing period for oilseed rape, and these red severe damages all crop up in the second half of that period. There are some very late sowings that were not damaged, but they were probably outside the region. So here is a summary of some other bits of information. The combined damage score is just a sort of integrated score from all the observations. Looking at variety type, some farmers put in a response for a whole farm, and that included some conventional varieties and some hybrids. So they go down as mixed types with separated conventional and hybrids. And really, there's no significant difference between the type of variety used, but it's interesting to see that actually the hybrids showed slightly more damage than the conventionals, and that's easy to understand because they would normally be sown at a lower seed rate than the conventionals. When we looked at the type of establishment that had been used, we saw that the least damage was associated with auto-casting, although very few, only 7 observations were made on that. Auto-casting is when the seed is thrown into the standing crop of wheat as it's harvested, so it's very, very early sown. So we can understand that showing less damage. And then looking through the other treatments, ploughing, non-inversion, subcasting, direct drilling, the best seed beds will often be associated with ploughing. It's not a popular thing because it's an expensive cultivation, but the next best low damage score was associated with ploughing, and direct drilling gave the worst results. We were able to look at seed treatments, and it was just interesting to see that the most severe damage on average was associated with neonic treated seed, and that's probably because it was used in the most vulnerable parts of the country. So it's just down to pressure from the beetles. Now we started companion crop work at Harvest 2015. And I chose 3 locations. We chose Sutton Scotney in Hampshire, where we expected little or no damage. We chose Morley in Norfolk, where we expected light damage, and we went for Hinxton outside Cambridge, where we expected very severe beetle damage. So let me tell you about the experiment itself. So it was a combination of variable oilseed rape seed rates from 60 up to 100, and hang on, I was going to play with my pointer, up to 120 seeds. No, I don't want you to do that. And so in the first treatment we grew oilseed rape on its own in 4 separate seed rates, and then using the same 4 seed rates we grew 3 combinations of companion species with it, and these were fenugreek, which was reported to have some insect deterrent activity. I went for an insect attractant combination, hoping that that would dilute the pest damage, and I went for species which I hoped would be killed off during the winter by the frost. So I went for pak choy and Chinese cabbage, salad rocket, and linseed. Linseed, from my experience of spring linseed, was always very vulnerable to spring flea beetles, so I thought that would be a good variety crop to put in there. And we went for an insect neutral crop. Cover crops are being promoted for oilseed rape of legumes, just to promote fertility. And so I thought, well, we'll try that. Berzine clover, crimson clover, Persian clover, and common vetch, just to see what happens. 4 replicates, 3 sites. The generalized plot, here's a single plot. My ambition was to have a carpet of these companion species and quite distinct rows of oilseed rape drilled in on top of those. So they were drilled on the same day but in 2 separate exercises. And you can see that the green lines are the oilseed rape and the pink lines are the companion crops, and the green lines will be sitting on one of the pink rows. So I hope that's reasonably clear. So these are photographs taken down in Sutton, Scotland, where the establishment of the trial was absolutely excellent, and yeah, perfect plots, and fate would prove that there was no insect pressure there at all. Let's take a closer look at them, and what I was seeing was that the fenugreek and the legume mix were very slow to develop from a early September sowing, whereas the mixed brassicas and the linseed developed quite well and were much more effective as companions. We've got some damage observations. These are from Cambridge. Okay, so we've got 2 record dates and we've got individual records for the different seed rates, but the differences there are quite small, so let's just concentrate on the treatment means. So these are the treatment means averaged over the different seed rates, and all we can really pick out is that the oilseed rape and exotic brassica and linseed mix had lower numbers, lower levels of damage, and that was immediately of great interest. Morley also gave us some observations, and although slightly less dramatic, it's pretty well the same pattern, particularly at this. Those dates are wrong, by the way. That's not the 12th of January, that's the 12th of the 10th month, October. That's my mistake for crowding the columns. But you can see this 12th of October date has got a lower level of damage associated with the brassica mix once again. Our friend Duncan Coston from University of Reading and Rothamsted Research also did some observations on the same site, on the Cambridge site, because we were trying to work up a project to progress together, and his observations on the damage levels on the oilseed rape were very much in line with our own, and Duncan also recorded damage on the companion species, and it's pretty obvious that the beetles were not interested by the vetches or clovers or the fenugreek or the linseed, but they did graze the other brassicas, and that's why the level of damage on the oilseed rape was reduced. There were no killing frosts in 2015-16, so the companion species did not die out. And when we tried to control them with herbicides after Christmas, these proved pretty ineffective. We were limited by the timings on the label regulations, and particularly in the brassica and linseed mix, the companion species survived rather too well and crowded out the oilseed rape to a high extent, and we can see that when we look at some yields now. So these are the yields at Southern Scotland. The average yield, about 3.5, was fairly acceptable for that part of the country. But what we can see is that in this brassica mix, at all the seed rates, the yields were lower because of the competitive effect of the companions and our lack of ability to control them with herbicides. And that's a whole topic for future research. At Morley, it was very disappointing yields, terrible yields on that site in that year. some of the best yields appeared to come from the brassica and linseed mix. Unfortunately, that's because most of the yield was linseed and not oilseed rape. So really that mixture failed badly in its purpose on that site. Worst news at Cambridge, nothing survived in the end. The seed lot that we'd used of the oilseed rape was rather poor, and the population was much lower than we'd set out to establish, and having survived some early beetle damage, the rest of the predators crowded in, the pigeons, the deer, the rabbits, and there was just nothing left. Even though a few meters away there were perfectly well established successful yield trials sown 4 days earlier. So that was a complete failure. Back to beetle biology. I'll need another 10 minutes, Sylvia. New attempts to monitor the beetles as they approached 2016, and we favour sticky traps like these. So I put them in the hedges and in the crop and on the ground, and really we found no cabbage stem flea beetle activity at all. There's no migration that we could detect. The beetles you can see on the yellow sticky trap are all pollen beetles. There's one beetle here on the yellow sticky trap, and a few just sitting in the crop, and I think this is their estivating, their resting phase. You can see where they chew away at the pods and do a little bit of damage, but nothing of economic importance. But we learnt, I put a lot of effort in, and we learnt nothing about their migratory habits from this exercise. So from that year we concluded that early establishment and good seedbed conditions were needed, but that does not guard against subsequent larval infestation. We learnt that neonics were no longer a reliable defence. Trap cropping can help, and companion crops can possibly play a part if the companion species can be controlled either by the weather or by herbicides. And we learnt that pre-emergent herbicides can possibly hold the crop back. So to 2016-17, some breeders are moving out of the area. They're taking their own work away. We're grateful that many of them stayed with us. They had more faith perhaps than we did. We maintained a large presence. We had something like 34 hectares of trials in the Hinxton area outside Cambridge. But we hit another dry season, and the few showers that we had were only enough to germinate the seed, but not to get it to grow away quickly. And we had terrible flea beetle problems again, and this was the story over much of the southeast of England. The government didn't help in this year. They withdrew their permission for neonic treated seed in the worst affected counties, and they removed their permission for the insecticide sprays. So there was a dry September, high numbers of beetles, and more commercial crop losses. And then, as I've already told you, there were better, colder conditions in the autumn and reduced egg-laying and larval development, so that we're seeing fewer of the pests coming into this year. So we're hoping for less pressure this coming year. We did work monitoring the migration at one site at Broom's Barn, thanks to Cheryl Turnbull, my colleague there. She's given me this data, and it's clear that the peak time for beetles migrating into the area is pretty well the end of the third week in September, and that ties up with previous observations, but this is the first time we've got numbers to put against the observations. And these really are cabbage stem flea beetles on sticky traps, and we really like these sticky traps. We think they're much more user-friendly than water traps. And once again, my demonstration plots established beautifully under the insect netting. Here's the crowdsourcing map from last year, and you can see that in the east in particular there are some black pins indicating farmers who have gone out of the crop for the time being, and I can see that the red pins are extending outside the usual region of East Anglia, north, west and south. Companions for 2016-2017 changed them a bit. We needed to save money on the initial ambitious experiments, so I went down to 3 seed rates of 60, 90 and 120 seeds of oilseed rape per metre square. I kept the fenugreek treatment in just for one more year, and I kept the exotic brassicas in. I left linseed out of this mixture, and this year I was able to get some open pollinated cheaper seed of Chinese brassicas. The previous year it had been expensive elite hybrid seed, which was obviously not economic, so we put in some cheaper seed of imported Chinese brassicas. And I tried a new mixture with salad rocket and white mustard. That's Sinapis alba and Eruca sativa. Rocket is Eruca sativa. And I tried buckwheat. So here is the fenugreek plot at Cambridge. It came through very strongly. And, well, to cut to the heart of the matter, there's no surviving oilseed rape in there. Here is the exotic brassicas, no surviving oilseed rape in there, and not much of the brassicas either. In the background you can see the buckwheat, which is a perfect companion because it grows and it dies quickly, it flowers and dies. No surviving oilseed rape in there. This is the in front of the buckwheat, there's the oilseed rape on its own. No surviving plants in there. Here are the mustard plots, and looking beyond the mustard plots you can see the devastation of 34 hectares of bare ground with just weeds surviving the oilseed rape. But when we look down into the mustard, what have we here? I can't get hold of this. Oh yes, here we are. Here is a row of oilseed rape. Here is another row of oilseed rape. Here is a row of oilseed rape, and here is a row of oilseed rape. So astonishingly, in 9 plots of mustard in that field are the only surviving oilseed rape plants, and I'm quite excited about this. The observations from Morley that year also showed that the lower levels of damage were associated with the mustard and rocket plots. Nearly there, Sylvia, don't panic. The good news was that everything except the rocket proved susceptible to frost. We had some decent frosts last winter, and everything was killed off. We did spray the trial itself to finish off the rocket plants, but it was good news there. So we think that that combination has some potential for protecting the crop, but if we leave it to control the surviving companions after Christmas, it does result in stunting of the oilseed rape and reduced yield potential. So we know there's much work still to do on working out the ideal seed rates of the companion species and the best timing for spraying. Now, I can't remember what's coming next. Oh, here's a photograph. We put in single plots. We put in plots of single species of the companions. So right in front of you can see the white mustard, which is flowered and died very successfully in the winter. That's just through frost. But alongside it is the salad rocket, which is tall and flowering and absolutely not what you want in a companion crop, because that did result in stunted plants. And I think I can just about demonstrate that here. It's difficult for you to see here, but if you look around these three plots, which are three seed rates of the same companions, they are not in flower, whereas everything else is ahead of them and coming into flower. So it has stunted the crops, the oilseed rape plants. So my overall conclusions are that cabbage stem flea beetles remain a huge threat to oilseed rape.